Welcome to the Florida Master Naturalist Program, an environmental education curriculum designed to increase awareness and appreciation of Florida's natural resources. Your host is Dr. Marty Main, wildlife ecologist with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. Join Marty and his special guests as they take you on a tour of Florida's spectacular natural world.
Historically, pine communities dominated much of the Florida landscape. In fact, even today, pine habitats still constitute most of Florida's natural areas, and in fact have been called the matrix into which other habitats, such as wetlands and hardwood hammocks, are interspersed. And let's start with longleaf pine, which once dominated much of Florida, and in fact, much of the coastal plain of the southeastern United States. Longleaf pine once ranged from Virginia to Texas and covered nearly 90 million acres. Straight and towering more than 100 feet tall, ancient longleaf pines were once the most valuable trees in America. They were highly valued for all building purposes, especially for masts and planking, and pitch, tar, and turpentine needed to build sailing ships during the 1800s. Even the keel of the USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides, was a single beam from an ancient longleaf pine. Relentless logging all but eliminated virgin forest by 1920, and today, longleaf pine encompasses only about 2 to 3% of its historical range. Longleaf pine habitats vary because of slight differences in soils, topography, and moisture. Let's visit the driest of the longleaf pine habitats, where we'll meet Kevin Robertson, a fire ecologist with Tall Timbers Research.
Marty, this is a good example of a longleaf pine upland sandhills community.
Kevin, the first thing I notice is that this is a very open habitat.
That's right. The chief reason for that is fire. We have very frequent fires here, one every 1 to 5 years.
All right, I see. I noticed that the longleaf pines have evidence of fire on them. Tell me a little bit about the adaptations of the longleaf pine to fire.
Well, first of all, the adult longleaf pines are extremely resistant to fire. It's very difficult to kill a longleaf pine with fire unless it's been badly scarred. Also, its very long pine needles form a great fuel for fire, and it produces a higher biomass than any other tree in pine needles, and there are also chemical properties of the needles that help it to burn very well. So it actually enhances its fire environment with its own needles.
I understand also that the juvenile longleaf pine is uniquely adapted to fire.
That's correct. They have a very dense bunch of needles around the apical meristem so that even at the very earliest stages it can survive fairly intense fires.
I see. Now, I noticed some indicator species of a typical longleaf pine community, wiregrass being one.
That's correct. Wiregrass tends to be an indicator species of areas throughout Florida, whether sandhills or clay hills, and one of its characteristics is that it only flowers if it's burned from about early May to somewhere into the summer.
I noticed some other species here. Can you tell me a little bit about some of these hardwoods that are growing?
Sure. Well, some of the hardwood species that I consider to be indicator species of these well-drained sandhills include the bluejack oak, or Quercus incana, which you can tell by its velvety leaves, and also the sand post oak, or Quercus margareta, that we have an example of right here. Maybe one of the chief hardwood indicators in my mind is the turkey oak. And when I see this, I think that it's probably a sandhill area.
Now, these oaks are very low growing. I imagine fire has something to do with that.
That's certainly true. If it weren't for fire, most of these small oak, what look like seedlings, would quickly turn into adults that would shade out all of the understory, and the entire community composition would change.
So fire's necessary to maintain this community.
That's correct. And it doesn't kill the individuals, but it just top kills them. So they sprout right back from the same roots year after year after year.
Now, in addition to some indicator plant species, we also have some indicator wildlife species.
That's certainly true. And one of them that comes to mind is the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker, which depends on this open, frequently burned habitat for its survival, as well as very large longleaf pine trees.
Now, Kevin, one of the things that I've also understand is that the longleaf pine community in general has declined considerably in Florida and throughout the coastal plain.
That's also certainly true. The estimates say there are only about 2 to 3% of what there once was. There are various reasons for that. One of them, of course, was logging. But even the cutting of the trees doesn't necessarily eradicate where most of the biodiversity is, right here in the understory. So another reason is fire suppression. Because as we said, without the fire, you can't keep these hardwoods in check and keep this large number of native herbs and grasses within the community. And of course, the other reason is development, including uses for agriculture. Because one characteristic of this native understory is that it's highly sensitive to soil disturbance. It has to do with it being adapted to fire and putting all of its resources underground so it can resprout after a fire.
Right.
But if you disturb that soil, then it has no more resources and it tends to be invaded by weedy plants and we lose that native biodiversity.
Longleaf Pine sandhill communities in Central Florida take on some different characteristics. This is Reed Noss. He's a professor of conservation biology at the University of Central Florida. Reed, can you tell me a little bit about this habitat?
Well, one thing you notice, Marty, is that the hills here in Central Florida aren't quite as pronounced as some other places in the state. But for Central Florida, this is actually pretty hilly. And you know, there's a variety of differences as you go from the Panhandle down the peninsula. The plant species composition changes a bit. In this case, we're looking at a longleaf pine community that's in the process of being restored by the state park personnel.
I see, and obviously they're using fire to restore this habitat.
Yeah, this area was burned just within the last few months, and you notice how quickly things come back here.
Right. Now, longleaf pine, of course, are very adapted to fire.
Well, we just picked up a couple cones. As you can see, these cones are big, and in fact, they get about twice this size in some cases. They release these big seeds that fall into bare mineral soil after a fire, and they may stay in this, what they call grass stage as a seedling for 5, 10, sometimes as long as 15 years or more. They look like a grass.
Right, and they're highly resistant to fire in that stage.
Very resistant to fire. And then what happens, they start to grow very rapidly to get to a height where they can then become again invulnerable to fire. And at this stage, they're often vulnerable, but as you can see, this one did just fine.
Now, there's another pine tree that can sometimes be found in this community that has an entirely different fire strategy.
The sand pine. We've got some right over here. Here's a good example of mature sand pine right there, Marty.
Oh, yeah.
And it's reproduced, it looks like. These are some of its babies, a few years old.
Well, the first thing I noticed is that these have grown up in a clump.
Yeah, this pine is very different. Look how spindly these things are. Short little stems, very narrow stems. And this pine is actually fire adapted, even though a fire in a longleaf pine sandhills that normally occurs, say, on a frequency of every 2 to 5 years would kill these. This pine has a different strategy.
Right, associated with the cones.
Basically, what happens is when you get hot fire come through, it might kill the adult, but the adult then opens its cones, its serotinous cones that are very closed, dense with sap, opens up, spills the seeds, and they grow up in profusion.
Sand pines are an opportunistic and short-lived species that depend on fire to create suitable growing conditions. When fire is suppressed, sand pines can form dense stands in longleaf pine habitat and may also form dense stands in scrub. As we move into flatter and wetter areas, the habitat changes into what is described as a pine flatwoods community.
As you can see, Marty, this flatwoods is aptly named. It's very flat.
Right. And I noticed that actually we have a different species of pine here.
This is a slash pine flatwoods. There's several kinds of flatwoods. We can have longleaf pine flatwoods, same species of tree as we just saw in the sandhills. The sandhills tend to be, as the name implies, a little higher ground, deeper sand. Here in the flatwoods, very level ground, water table is close to the surface. Often there's a clay hard pan right below the surface, so water will be standing for part of the year.
All right. Now, the other thing that's really noticeable about this slash pine flatwoods is the strong shrub component.
And that reflects the increased soil moisture content. There's more water out there to spread around. So we've got Lyonias here, we've got blueberry, we've got salt palmetto, and that gets even denser if your sand goes a long time without a burn, or if you have burning more in the winter than in the summer.
All right, and there's a lot of emphasis these days on burning summer burns for various reasons, including flowering of wiregrass.
That's correct. And wiregrass, I'm glad you pointed that out, because that is the dominant grass both here in the flatwoods as well as in the more upland sandhills. and clay hills.
All right, so fire is an important management technique in pine flatwoods communities.
Absolutely. These really burn just as regularly under a natural fire regime as the sandhills do.
Right, and I understand that if it even gets a little wetter, we'll have another species of pine that is present.
Even wetter flatwoods are generally pond pine flatwoods. The pond pine's unique because, well, it's easy to recognize. You can see a lot of the needles and small stems coming right out of the main trunk and the larger branches.
Right, and that'll often transition right into a bayhead.
Yeah. In fact, the pond pine community is pretty much a wetland. It's right in that ecotone between upland and wetland.
As we travel to extreme South Florida, the landscape changes, the hydrology changes, and this has some profound influences on pine flatwoods communities. Our next stop is Big Cypress National Preserve, where pine flatwoods take on a different character and are dominated by the South Florida slash pine, which possesses some unique adaptations. Our guide is Jim Snyder, plant ecologist with the U.S. Geological Service. Jim, the flat South Florida landscape has important seasonal influences on these pine flatwoods communities.
Sure. The fact that South Florida is so flat and so low means that if it rains much, the water collects and you develop sheet flow over the surface. This pineland that we're in right now, even though it's crunchy dry here in late May, come the middle of the wet season, maybe July, August, could be covered with water. There might be several inches of water here for several months during the year.
So in fact, during the summer, or the rainy season, this is actually like a wetland.
Yeah. The understory plants really, if you took away the canopy trees and got rid of all the palms, this could be a wet prairie. The same species, grasses, sedges, even the other forbs are also found in wet prairies.
Right. So South Florida slash pine are uniquely adapted to flooding events, but they have some other adaptations as well.
Well, South Florida slash pine is a very tough tree. I think it's sort of similar to longleaf pine found further north in that it can withstand very wet conditions in these hydric flatwoods, but it can also grow in very dry habitats. It's similar to longleaf pine also in that it has a relatively long needle and very resistant to fire.
Right. Now I understand that historically lightning was important.
Sure. I think lightning was one of the major sources of fires. As a matter of fact, I think there's a lightning-struck tree we could look at right over here. Before people were here in South Florida, lightning was the only source of ignition for fires.
Right, and of course lightning would be associated with thunderstorms.
Exactly. Thunderstorms in South Florida usually begin in May through September. Now, right now, we're in kind of an extended dry season. We haven't had thunderstorms yet, but it's very dry at the end of the dry season. Those early thunderstorms are the ones that give you the big fires, burn the largest area.
Right. Now, South Florida slash pine is uniquely adapted to fire with the needles and the bark, but there's other plants here that are also adapted to fire.
Sure. Well, obviously, everything that grows here has to be able to withstand fire. The palms are a very good example. We have both a cabbage palm, this little cabbage palm here, and lots of saw palmetto, which is typical of flatwoods. The way palms grow, the growing point is hidden well within the stem and well insulated from the fires.
Mm-hmm. So when a fire grows, it doesn't damage that growing part of the plant.
Exactly. It could burn the leaves completely off, but the growing point is still protected. Much like in grasses, the growing point is really below ground, so that a fire goes through, burns up the surface fuel, but the growing points are insulated by the soil.
Now, we've mentioned some of the adaptations of plants, but there are also some, this habitat's important for some wildlife species as well.
Sure. Actually, here in extreme South Florida, there's a unique population of red-cockaded woodpeckers, which is a very unusual woodpecker in that it only nests in live pine trees.
Right, whereas most woodpeckers
would have to be in dead trees and snags, which is typical of most woodpeckers.
Jim, with an endangered species such as the red-cockaded woodpecker, you must have some pretty specific management plans.
Well, sure. Actually, management for the red-cockaded woodpecker as part of this flatwoods ecosystem requires frequent fire. It's not possible anymore to let lightning run the system because fires might occur under severe conditions, etc. So the Park Service has a very aggressive prescribed burning program. As a matter of fact, it's the biggest prescribed burning program in the National Park Service.
Right, and I imagine your management program also addresses other issues such as exotic species.
Oh, sure. There's a very large program for exotic species removal here. The removal of Melaleuca was a major undertaking.
Well, with that, and this is a pretty healthy looking habitat, what are some of the major conservation issues for pine flatwoods throughout South Florida?
Well, obviously one is seeing that they burn frequently enough. This gets very difficult in urbanized areas where you have urban-wildland interface. And the loss of habitat, of course. This is prime real estate for the development of South Florida.
Pineland habitats throughout Florida have been converted to other uses, such as development and agriculture. We need to consider, however, the role of agricultural complexes in providing habitat diversity and wildlife values throughout the Florida landscape. To give us an idea of the role that agriculture plays in providing habitat for wildlife, we're joined by Ricky Bass, a farm manager for Duda & Sons in South Florida. Ricky, one of the things that impresses me when I come onto a large agricultural operation such as this one is the diversity of land uses across the landscape.
That's right, Marty. Here at Duda's at the LaBelle location, we have approximately 28,000 acres. 10,000 acres of it is in citrus. We have a couple thousand acres of sod, have a little bit of sugar cane, and about 12,000 acres of pasture land.
What about wildlife? Do they utilize these different agricultural crops?
Marty, you'll be surprised at how much wildlife utilizes not only citrus, but other commodities as well. You'll see does with their fawns a lot in the grove. You'll see bucks, laying underneath the trees, the citrus trees getting shade. So not only do they use the groves for food, but they use it for habitat as well.
Well, what about, do you look at a sod farm, for instance? You wouldn't think there's a whole lot of habitat value there.
Well, it's funny, you're right. You think when you look out on the sod field that there wouldn't be a whole lot of usage of wildlife, but sandhill cranes, hundreds of sandhill cranes every year use the sod fields for nesting, and it's a pretty sight to see the sandhill cranes out there.
Now, we mentioned the fact that you've got crops on a farm, of course, that's natural, but I also see lots of natural areas, such as this pine flatwoods.
That's right. Most of our refuge places or untouched areas are pine flatwoods, but we do have cypress, we do have water reservoirs, so different type of species for each refuge.
A good example of how agriculture can produce a commodity while preserving natural areas is the grazing of cattle in unimproved pasture, or what Ricky refers to as natural pasture land. Ricky, this isn't what most people would consider to be a typical cattle pasture.
Marty, this is what I mean when I say natural pasture land here. It's still in its natural state, and we graze cattle on this.
Yeah, so you run cows through this pine flatwoods. I see that you've recently had a fire in here.
Yes, we prescribe burn all of our acreage at least every 3 years or so.
So you burn all your pine flatwoods and your wetlands too, I'm assuming?
Yes, out in the groves we have reservoirs during the dry season. When they dry up enough, we burn them as well.
So you guys have an active management plan for the farm?
Yes, we do, Mark. We try to control Brazilian peppers as well as tropical soda apples and any other exotic species that we see that we need to take care of.
What about your wildlife?
Oh, we have a great management wildlife program in place. We take data of all the game that we harvest, and we kind of review it every year and sit down with biologists and go over the data and see where we need to go with that.
That's great. That sounds a lot like what natural resource managers do for public lands.
Marty, farmers are good environmental stewards. You have to be today. With the way the economics are, you've got to take care of the land, because if it don't, it's not going to take care of you.
Florida has many kinds of upland habitats. Some are dominated by characteristic forest communities, such as pinelands and hardwood forests. Others, such as scrub, dry prairie, and rangelands, are not. Sea level has historically influenced Florida's shape and size, and, at times, all but the highest areas of the peninsula were beneath the sea. As sea levels subsided, these ancient dune systems became isolated as a series of ridges in the center of the state, the largest of which is known as the Lake Wales Ridge. Today, we refer to these ancient dune systems as scrub, and these areas provide critical habitat for many unique plants and animals that evolved adaptations to survive in these harsh environments. We travel to the Archbold Biological Station on the Lake Wales Ridge, where we'll explore several types of scrub habitat with scrub ecologist Mark Dayruck. Mark, you mentioned that this is called an oak scrub, but I don't see any giant oaks in this habitat. Can you tell me a little bit about why this is called an oak scrub?
Well, most of the plants you see out here are oaks, and they may be small, but they're old. So this one here, for example, is a mature oak, and you can tell that because it's got these catkins on it. These are the male flowers, and the female flowers are even smaller than that. It's a wind-pollinated plant, so as the wind blows over the scrub, it pollinates all these oaks. And this is a species which has been burned off and resprouted and burned off and resprouted many times. And they grow underground. So if you think of a tree that lives in a forest up north, it dominates territory by moving out like that and shading its neighbors. But you can't do that if fires come along. So these do the opposite. They dominate territory by moving underground. So they have roots that spread out all around them. And every time there's a burn, all those roots sprout. So you get hundreds and hundreds of shoots. And that's what you're seeing out here. Thousands of oak shoots that are fighting for space after the fire that came through here in 2001.
Now, although this is an oak scrub, certainly there are many more plants than just oaks in this habitat.
So a lot of the plants you see around here are either palmettos or they're species that are in the blueberry family. So this is one here. This is in the blueberry family. This is called well, there's a couple of species. There's stagger bushes and fetter bushes. They have these pretty little pink flowers.
Right, these are the Lyonia genus.
Right. And the group of the blueberries is very resistant to poor soil conditions. So they grow in bogs, but they also grow on these extraordinarily sterile sands. And if you were to try and grow normal plants on these sands, you wouldn't get anywhere because there are virtually no nutrients available.
Mark, there are many plants that are found only in Florida scrub, the scrub palmetto being one. You want to tell me a little bit about this plant?
Yeah, this is a common scrub plant, and you can tell it from regular palmettos or saw palmettos because the stem of the leaf goes right up the leaf like that. Plus, it's got these nice little fibers on, all curled up, and these are what scrub jays use to make their nests out of. In fact, at the right season, in nest building season, if you hold these up, scrub jays may come take them right out of your fingers. And you have to look at everything in terms of fire adaptations here. And this one has a fire adaptation, which is that the growing point, the vulnerable growing point of the plant is underground, buried quite deep in the sand. So when a fire comes through, it doesn't kill the plant.
Mark, now we've looked at several species in this community, and it strikes me that most of them resprout.
Yeah, this is what you might call a sprouter community because it's formed of plants that sprout right after a fire. And they've been constantly rejuvenated or made young again by the fire. So that these plants here could be virtually immortal. These little oaks that are just up to your waist, they could be hundreds or even thousands of years old. They could be as old as the redwoods.
So it's not just the landform that's old, it's the plants as well.
That's right. It's an ancient habitat full of ancient species.
The preceding was a short sample of the curriculum for the Florida Master Naturalist Program series. For more information, visit the Florida Master Naturalist Program website or contact your local University of Florida County Extension office.